I wish to be in touch with the poorest of the poor among Indians, Gandhi himself said. It is our duty to dress them first and then dress ourselves, to feed them first and then feed ourselves. The story as I tell it departs at various points from what I call the received narrative, nearly all of which is traceable to Gandhi's autobiographical writings churned out as a series of articles for his weekly newspaper, Young India, in the 1920s, when he'd been back in India scarcely a decade and still had more than 20 years to go in his life's journey. Here, the chapters of his earlier life were turned into parables for the benefit of those who soldiered in his movement. In the process, these invaluable texts simplify his story. He was a more complicated, divided man than he sometimes let on. Witness the fact that this great apostle of nonviolence, who inspired our own Martin Luther King and other leaders of the civil rights movement, saw service in 2 South African wars as leader of detachments of non-combatant Indian stretcher bearers, or that a few years after his return to India, he offers to serve as a recruiting agent for the Viceroy seeking to raise Indian troops for British units depleted by the carnage in the trench warfare of World War I. A singularly unsuccessful campaign that ends with his placing his own name at the head of his short list of volunteers. At that point, he was 50 years old. Defeat and disappointment, he wrote at the end of one of his autobiographical collections called Satyagraha in South Africa, are unknown to those who commit themselves to Satyagraha. That's his catch-all term, coined to embrace both his method and his doctrine. Satyagraha, usually defined as truth force, or more literally as firmness in truth. But defeat and disappointment were by no means unknown to him in India. I'll come back to South Africa, but first perhaps I should address the question of why Gandhi matters. For starters, because he fashioned the first anti-colonial mass movement of the 20th century, because he sought to achieve its ends by nonviolent means, promoting a doctrine not just of nonviolence, but of nonviolent mobilization and struggle, inaugurating a weapon that, with very mixed results, still comes into play in our own time, most memorably in recent months in Cairo and Tunis, but also less successfully in Tripoli, Tehran after the last Iranian election, or scattered Palestinian villages on the West Bank. He looms large also because more than any other political figure of modern times I can think of, he came to identify himself with the plight of the poorest, most abject shanty dwellers and landless rural laborers, who number today in global terms more than 1 billion souls. In today's soaring, prideful, turbulent India, with its newly minted technology billionaires and lust for big power status, still more than 300 million. That's 300 million individual Indians in conditions the World Bank terms absolute poverty. If India has a social conscience, and I believe it does, that social conscience can still be called Gandhian. It is in his finest, most radical moments, Gandhi nagged Indians about a suffering India that's all around them and that many of them are conditioned from childhood not to see. Here was a man who moved a subcontinent but never for a minute held any government office in a public career lasting more than half a century. A leader who never bombed anything, never had to inure himself to any pattern of death and destruction, who almost invariably halted his campaigns the moment he got a whiff of what we've now learned to call collateral damage.